I'll be showing you folks in this video my final 2024 election projection. Over 4 years have passed while we have been covering this race. Review hundreds of polls, forecasts, and betting markets, and it all boils down to this. I precisely projected Joe Biden's exact 306 to 232 electoral vote win in 2020. And here today I am unveiling my final 2024 electoral map projection. We will thus just start right away. Not a cause for time wasting. Starting with the safe states for both candidates, races Harris or Trump will win by 12 percentage points or more will first be discussed. Beginning with these safe Trump states, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota, all of Nebraska except its 2nd district, as well as Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Indiana, South Carolina, and Alaska. Kamala Harris will then be sweeping the West Coast, claiming Washington, Oregon, and California. Along with Hawaii, Illinois, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, the District of Columbia, and the 1st District of Maine. She will visit Kamala Harris is at 181 electoral votes, Donald Trump at 125. But this is hardly reason for concern given all the safe states are filled in. With the plausible states, he will cover a great distance. Therefore, 5 to 12 points are the deciding factors in these races. Though one candidate will still have a rather clear advantage, they will be notably more competitive than the solid states. First, let us begin with the most likely states for the former president. He is definitely going to do exceptionally well in the lower Midwest in Ohio and Iowa. He has regularly carried in the past 2 election cycles these 2 states. Really, just consider how the map appeared in 2012. Ohio went at Obama by 3%. Iowa went at Obama by 6%. Trump moves Iowa 15 points to the right just 4 years later, and it goes to him by 9.4%. Ohio shows an 11-point change. Trump earns an 8.1% Buckeye State victory. Trump does it once more in 2020, when everyone believes Joe Biden will outperform Hillary Clinton. He wins Iowa with an 8.2% margin. Ohio by 8. Essentially the same margins. Trump can most likely win these 2 states by 10 points or more against Kamala Harris, but getting over 12 will prove rather difficult. Thus, they will be classified as likely Republican. Texas and Florida come next. 2 more races that simply won't be close. Trump took home both of these states in 2016 and 2020. Texas has lately always been a Republican bastion. Since 1976 and Jimmy Carter's election, it hasn't gone blue. Still, Florida used to always be among the most competitive states in the Union. Actually, in 2012, it was the only tilt state visible on the map. 2016 saw once more a decision based less than 2 points. Trump prevailed in Florida by 1.2. Then in 2020, when most people predicted Joe Biden to win the state back for Democrats, Trump triples his margin and most likely will act similarly once more. Florida polling shows the former president leading by about 8 points. He will most certainly prevail at least double-digit margin. In Texas, meanwhile, Trump is looking great as well. In a state he merely carried by 5.6 in 2020, his polling average leads by 8 points. And this was the case when asked. He was merely expected to win by 1. Indeed, polls taken at the very end of the 2020 cycle indicated that Trump was barely likely to beat Biden in the Lone Star State. That was clearly always going to be erroneous. Texas won not go blue for a very long period. Today most certainly belongs to Republicans. We now also have Maine's 2nd district at last. It isn't going to be close. Trump is going to triumph 3 times. And thus, with the solid and likely states now occupied for the former president, Donald Trump takes front stage. Just 51 votes separate him from the presidency at 219 electoral votes. But now we'll fill in Kamala Harris's expected states, races she'll win by 5 to 12 points. We shall first travel westward from Colorado and New Mexico, 2 states purchased and showed rather good performance in the past election. In Colorado, he beat Trump 13.5 percentage point-wise. It was exactly blue. Biden carried New Mexico by 10.8. Even then, Kamala Harris is en route to win Colorado by less than a double-digit margin today. She most likely carries it by 8 or 9. Surely a notable decline from the 4 years ago Democratic level. Similar thing apply in New Mexico. Kamala Harris will not be winning by a double-digit margin. If she even makes it by with a 7% margin of victory, Nowhere near 11 points should be lucky. Thus, the vice president will probably be of either race. Minnesota comes next, and I have Kamala Harris winning by just over 7 points. It will be more competitive than it was 4 years ago when Joe Biden carried Minnesota by 7.1%. He was running with Harris as his running buddy at this point. Kamala Harris comes from California, not close to Minnesota. Today, Kamala Harris is running alongside Governor Tim Walz, the literal governor of Minnesota. She is also hardly scoring above 5%. Actually, I think she is at 4.8 over Donald Trump in the state. Given Joe Biden performed better, that really is an abysmal margin. And Kamala Harris is once again running with the literal governor of the state. She should be winning by minimum 9 to 10 points. In 2022, Tim Walz was re-elected as governor by well over a double-digit margin. But Walz simply isn't performing quite as well with Kamala Harris on the ticket. Minnesota will hence be probably blue, but just barely. Harris is winning by somewhat over a 5-point margin. She will have a lot of other issues all around the map if she cannot surpass Joe Biden in the home state of her running buddy. We will now proceed to the Northeast, where Maine and New Hampshire reside, two states where Kamala Harris's performance will not be too unlike from Joe Biden's. What is likely to show a clear decline? In 2020, Joe Biden emerged victorious in New Hampshire by 7.4%. Kamala Harris is winning, maybe by 5 or 6. Maine came to Joe Biden by 9.1. Kamala Harris is winning roughly at 7 to 8 level. These are thus two races where the vice president's performance has been rather average. Generally, these states are moving left, every time Democrats are performing increasingly better. But Kamala Harris is on the ballot, thus we will see a change in that trend since she clearly cannot outperform the current president. Thus, although just barely, the Granite State in Maine will be probably blue-colored. The 2nd District of Nebraska comes next, where Joe Biden prevailed by 6.6%. The 2nd District is, however, actually more liberal than it was in the past since the lines have been altered following the 2020 census. Basically Omaha and some of the neighboring suburbs, Kamala Harris is on target to win by just under a double-digit margin. It's also probably blue. And last on this map, Virginia is the most likely state. Of course, from 2020, Kamala Harris will likely prevail by roughly half of Biden's 10-point margin. She will not be able to get anywhere over 7, most likely not over 6 either. Still, a 5-point margin of victory is reasonable given that even Hillary Clinton prevailed by more than 5% in 2016. Her performance all around was, of course, rather poor. Virginia, meantime, has been moving to the right. Harris is going to perform far worse than the current president for primarily this reason. Still, it's going to be probably for now. We shall be somewhat giving to the Democrats, and thus we have just the 7 battleground states left. This hardly surprises me at all. These are the 7 races we have been focusing mostly on over the whole year. And with them not yet filled in, Kamala Harris is that 226 electoral vote surpass at 219. Basically, the election is still a tie until we arrive to these battlefields. This group of 7 truly is just that. Though they account for only 93 of the electoral colleges, 538 votes, they truly hold all the power. The outcomes in every other state are essentially preordained. Now, for Minnesota, Virginia, or New Hampshire, for example, there were areas where Trump seemed to shine. Realistically, though, those are always far shots. Now it was plausible if Trump kept performing remarkably in those states. But now, with 1 day left to go, I am here to tell you that simply isn't going to happen. Anyone claiming Minnesota, Virginia, New Hampshire, or New Mexico is actually competitive is just lying to your face. Thus, 2 of the 7 states will be labeled as lead based on this. The other 5 will be tilting. Lean states will thus be decided by a 1 to 5 point margin. Obviously, tilt states fall short of 1. We'll start south in the Sun Belt. We first will begin with the 2 lean states. And just to let you know here, both of them will be attending Donald Trump. I start in Arizona, where Donald Trump is expected to prevail by 1 to 3 points. The proximity of these races makes anything feasible. However, given that Trump won Arizona by almost 4 points in 2016 and lost by 0.3 to Joe Biden in 2020, it most certainly seems that he will be winning in that state. The polls show Trump leading by 2.6% today. Based just on the graph here, his lead has only been rising as the election approaches. He is doing really nicely. He is quite improbable going to lose Arizona. For the former president, this is absolutely a winning state. Should he lose Arizona, the contest ends. As of right now, though, he most certainly will flip Arizona back. It will be the first lean red state mapped. And Georgia, on the other side of the Sun Belt, will naturally be the other lean state. Really, this race resembles the Arizona election rather closely. Trump lost Georgia barely as well, with 0.24% separating Biden from the former president. Now, both of these states were historic turns for Joe Biden in 2020. From 1996, no Democrat had won Arizona all around. Georgia, you have to go back to 1992. Now, given how historic these wins were for Democrats, Kamala Harris, who is performing far worse than Joe Biden, simply isn't in a position to achieve the success Biden had here 4 years ago. Like they have been voting for the past 30 years, both of these states are quite likely to revert into the Republican column. Georgia thus gives Trump 2.3% in the polling average favoritism. There is also a fresh New York Times poll showing Harris up by 1. Clearly, that is going to be erroneous. The New York Times consistently exaggerates Democratic count. After Harris peaked following the Democratic conference, Trump has been ahead essentially since early September. But starting in the middle of last month, Trump's lead has been widening. He is in a really good position here. Georgia's basic nature is still conservative, and on this map it will be the other lean Republican state. And so Arizona and Georgia are must victories, simply to chart Trump's possible routes to triumph here. Should Trump fail to secure these two states, it is quite improbable he will be able to win any of the other toss-ups that will ultimately yield 270 electoral votes. The good news is, though, that even if he loses, he is rather likely to win Georgia and Arizona. Thus, at the very least, this essentially represents his floor. Less than 1%, or perhaps slightly over 1%, will most likely determine all 5 of the surviving states. But since they are truly that competitive, I will be grouping them all under the tilt categories for either Democrats or Republicans. Now for Trump, North Carolina and Pennsylvania would be his fastest road to triumph. Although the Pennsylvania road would be more likely right now, it could also pass through North Carolina and Wisconsin. Nevada only has 6 electoral votes, thus winning Nevada doesn't really matter to Trump. North Carolina absolutely does. Actually, Trump is doing rather nicely in the Tar Heel state. His polling average leads by 1.5%. He is rather obviously the favorite. He brought North Carolina home in 2016 and 2020. From the 7 swing states he carried in both of the past 2 elections, this is the only one. He lost Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania in 2020, but North Carolina he managed to hang on to, and he's going to win it once more. I do have tilt Republican here. Though he has led the polling average the whole election cycle, the margin will be a somewhat smaller one. Mark Robinson, the Republican nominee for governor, is the reason North Carolina appeals to me as more competitive. He has conducted a campaign with disaster. He has participated in so many scandals. He will lose to Josh Stein almost by a double-digit margin. Robinson is not going to be able to pull Trump down in the presidential contest, but he is definitely not doing the former president any favors. Thus, I do have the Tar Heel state voting somewhat to the left of both Arizona and Georgia. With Trump at 262 electoral votes, he is thus only 8 away from the presidency. He will want any one of the 3 upper Midwestern states. With its 19 electoral votes, Pennsylvania is also quite likely to be the keystone state that helps him to calm his frenzy. There is rather close an election there. Trump sets the pace at 0.3%. Though Republicans are looking good, especially with early voting, it is absolutely going to go right to the wire. Following the early 2020 voting period, they lag by almost 1 million. Democrats lead nowadays by less than 500,000. Their target was a buffer of 500,000 or perhaps 600,000. Their reach fell short of that. And in a state they carried by just 80,000 votes 4 years ago, that little difference will be rather significant. The first attempted failed murder on Trump also happened in Pennsylvania. He will find some minor benefit from that. And once more, in a race as near as this one, every tiny bit counts. Pennsylvania will thus be the second tilt state on the map. By a quite small margin, I have it in Trump's favor. Although this election is close, we really don't need Arizona given wins in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Nonetheless, Donald Trump does cross the finish line with these 4 triumphs. He will still do a little bit more, though. With his 1% polling average advantage, Trump is also going to win Nevada. Now, since Nevada hasn't gone red since the 2004 election, victory here will be challenging for the former president. A win here would thus be rather significant. Although the two candidates are running closely according to the polls, Republicans are gaining ground in the Silver State. By defeating the current Democrat, Republicans gained the governorship of Nevada in 2022. Trump will thus also make notable advances here. With the former president ranking less than half a percentage point, it will be tilt Republican. Lastly, in Wisconsin and Michigan, these are essentially toss-ups. Usually I would classify them as toss-up and not fill them in at all. Clearly, though, I would assume you people would want me to respond for every one of these states. And in Wisconsin and Michigan, the polls essentially match Harris up by 0.3 in Wisconsin by 0.6 in Michigan. Now, the early voting numbers are the main reason I'm giving Kamala Harris a narrow lead rather than the polling. Comparatively to Pennsylvania and Nevada, the vice president is in a somewhat better posture. We all know, of course, that Wisconsin and Michigan will vote left of those two states. Given Pennsylvania and Nevada's proximity, I also see the most reasonable result as being the one whereby Kamala Harris barely edges Trump out in both Wisconsin and Michigan. If Trump were able to carry two states as well, though, I would most certainly not be surprised. This is it then. This is my projection for the 2024 elections. Final. Donald Trump gains 287 electoral votes, while Kamala Harris scores 251. Although it will be a close contest, Trump will be re-elected to be the 47th president, thus he will declare a clear victory. I really appreciate you folks watching. Verify your enjoyment of this video. If you liked it, subscribe to the channel and write down below who you believe will be the election winner.